Firstly, I believe that we are going to go into a period of significant turbulence. Social turbulence, economic turbulence, financial turbulence, environmental turbulence. And this is the metaphor for it. We're in this oil tanker which is going into a great big storm. The problem with an oil tanker is it's quite cumbersome to turn it around. And ideally, if you see the storm is coming, you want to act proactively and shift it. And so a key question I'm going to ask us is, what is the role of business in helping to shift and change direction? Because in many respects, business is the dominant institution of our time. It's in many respects, although recently that shifted back to the state, but we've moved from the church, from the state, into business. We spend more time in business, largely than we do with our families. We kind of inform our idea of self-worth from business. We probably are more effective as consumers than we are as citizens. There's no doubt that business has been part of the problem that we're facing. Of that there is no dispute. But business has the capacity to be part of the solution. A recent survey in the United Kingdom on climate change found that only 41% of those in the UK accept as an established scientific fact that global warming is taking place and is largely man-made. So that's the United Kingdom, less than half. We have a greenhouse effect. If we didn't have a greenhouse effect, we wouldn't be here. That's beyond dispute. I mean, we don't challenge the greenhouse effect. Certain gases which trap greenhouse gases, which trap the incoming radiation, some of it bounces off, some goes into the earth here, some comes out, and some of it gets trapped, and that's the key bit. It gets trapped by greenhouse gases and comes down. Okay? Just like a greenhouse. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be here. Greenhouse gases, we have a whole range of these, which we're fairly familiar with. The most predominant, methane and carbon dioxide. Methane, 21 times the global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So if we look where we are now, we extrapolate this, we're currently around 380 parts per million. So we're above anything we've been in recent history. Okay? Last time we were there was around 3 million years ago. If we were to reduce our emissions by 70% globally, so fundamentally change our assumptions around business and how we operate, we could get up to, say, 550 parts per million by 2100. Last time we were there was 400 million years ago. If we carry on with business as usual, then we could get up to there. And if we get up to there, bearing in mind the correlation with temperature, we're talking 6 degrees. The last time the planet was there, the planet has been there, was millions of years ago, and 90% of the species went extinct. The planet adjusts, it's robust, but many of the species don't, and they disappear. So this is, in essence, the challenge that we're facing. We're at this aspect and we're growing. And what's very crucial is, what most scientists now agree, is we need to avoid a 2 degrees rise in temperature, because then you have runaway feedback mechanisms. So all the methane trapped in the Arctic tundra, the ice melts, the methane comes out, positive feedback loop. The capacity to absorb the CO2 gets reduced because it's overabsorbed, so another feedback loop. So you get beyond 2 degrees, there's this real concern, runaway climate change. If we look at South Africa briefly, they did a model around where are our emissions going in this country. So by 2050, 3 times our current emissions of greenhouse gases in this country. And so it was fairly alarming. So these business leaders say, oh my goodness. Where we need to be by science, if we believe the Jim Hansons and others, is a reduction. We're a developing country. We have less of a target to reduce than the developed does, because we have the right to develop. But we still need to peak very soon and then quite significantly reduce emissions. So climate change is not the only issue, but it's the issue I'm going to focus on. And it presents some interesting challenges for business. 3 elements I want to highlight, just to consolidate what I've said now about the science. Firstly, is scale. So if we're in the boardrooms and we're thinking through our future investments, have we really understood the scale of the challenge that is associated with moving into a post-carbon economy? Because it has profound implications. The second thing is urgency. The longer we delay, the more costly it's going to be, both in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation. The longer we delay, the steeper the curve has got to be to reduce, to get down to the required level of parts per million globally. And the third issue is we're working in a context where the response is woefully inadequate. And I don't think that these elements are sufficiently understood in many of the boardrooms in this country, nor necessarily in many of the academic institutions where these aspects are being taught. You know, I'm not going to get into a huge academic discourse about leadership, but let's just think through these elements and think through, if we buy the fact that we have a challenge, and if we accept that these are some of the characteristics which I'll explain now for business leaders, where do you think the organization that you operate in lies in this context? So the first characteristic is clearly that of being visionary and having a very good understanding of systems thinking. Really getting away from the minutiae of management aspects, but understanding the interconnectedness that is out there and the nature of the feedback loops, which are going to get more and more significant. What's really important is to have a degree of imagination. And I know, you know, we all love to laugh at Rumsfeld's statement, but actually I think it has a great degree of truth, is we need to understand, we need to know what we don't know. We need to anticipate the unknown unknowns. Secondly, is courage. And you need a high level of adaptive capacity. Because if we're going to go into turbulence, you need to be adaptable. You need to, if you're resilient, you have the capacity to change. If we look at those organizations, you know, the work of Ari de Geus and others that have been around 100 years or more, you'll see, you know, financially conservative. They treat their workers as human beings, not as dispensable widgets. But they've all changed their business model completely at least once. So they're adaptable. And it requires courage. It requires the ability to say, you know, most of these business models are wrong. And we need to change our assumptions around how we judge shareholder value and how we judge the value of companies. Charismatic. Yes, this bit here about the belief in the possible. That's, you know, to look at Obama, it's actually, yes, we can, and it's a bit of a cliche, yes, we can have a black man as president of the United States. It's possible. Yes, we can have a post-carbon future, and actually, it's a future which is better for all of us. The danger of us sustainability people is we stand up, like I've sort of done this morning, and say, I have a nightmare. And that's massively not inspirational. I have a dream where we live differently, where actually we create far more jobs through renewable energy. We have a much better work-life balance. We address issues around social capital. Integrity. Clear sense of the social contract. High levels of emotional intelligence. Real willingness to collaborate versus competition. And recognizing and learning from mistakes. We take these characteristics and apply them to climate change, and then I'll see where we are in this country. If you're visionary, you have a real understanding of the risks and opportunities that climate change presents, informed by a good, robust dialogue. Are we seeing real boldness in response strategies? Are we seeing really ambitious targets? Are we seeing organizations being sufficiently charismatic to exert pressure throughout their sphere of influence? Are we seeing the development of really proactive partnerships with some of your harshest critics, with some of your competitors? The CDP is a global initiative, been going for about 7-8 years, and its institutional investors send these series of questions on these issues to companies and ask them to respond. So it had been operating about 3 or 4 years in the UK, and then we brought it to this country, and it's now in its 3rd year. Firstly, I think it's really encouraging, one of the highest response rates globally. So 68% of the JSC 100 responded to this questionnaire, which puts us right up there. What's very interesting is the increase in what's called Scope 3 emissions. So not your direct emissions, but things to do with like employee business travel and through your supply chain. These are the different sectors: consumer, energy, financials, and so on. The key thing is you're seeing a big increase in Scope 3 emission disclosure. Why is that important? Well, it's understanding where your leverage is. What was also interesting was the relative emissions. So read these stats with some degree of caution, because it's still early days in capturing data. But here we're beginning to get almost a comparable. So you work at Suntum, 4.7 tons of CO2 equivalent per employee per annum. Investex 9.34. Now, massive cautions around this data. It's early days, but it's beginning to get us there. And then you realize if we get down to 2 tons, that's a fundamental shift in assumptions. These are the sectors that dominate, mining and energy. And what's very useful is to put into the room, which some of you will know, is the total emissions in this country and the emissions of 2 companies. So 400,000 or thereabout, 400 million tons in South Africa, roughly estimated, 440 or thereabouts, estimated total tons of CO2. Eskom is about 220 odd million of that 400 odd, and Sasol in its direct emissions, so excluding Eskom electricity, is around 60. The clearest issue of concern is the level of ambition of targets. If we look at what's required by science, it's some way off, our targets are some way off, and herein comes the real rub. If we take the science at what it is, and we want to get to 350 parts per million, we have to cut CO2 emissions. And sadly, everything we do in our current economic models results in CO2 emissions. If we look at the global 100 best companies and look at their targets, and we look at what's required by science, we need to cut emissions in developed economies by 80% by 2050. That's what the science is saying, that's what the politicians are saying. If we do that, we need to see a minimum annual global reduction rate of 3.9% per annum. If you look at the targets of the global 100 companies, we're getting just 1.9% per annum. So this shows what they call the carbon chasm, quite a big shortfall between what's required by science and where we're going. This is a scoring system we had to do following a methodology developed by the CDP in London and administered by PwC. And what it does is it measures the disclosure of companies and not their performance. There's a number of concerns with it, but what we found was many companies saying, oh, no, we don't mind about being rated on the index, we just want to change our performance. Well, as soon as they saw they weren't on the index, the chief executive was on the phone to the sustainability manager. Why have we been kicked off that index? This shows the new guys on the index. And it shows the inherent competitive spirit, which is understandable. It shows a degree of misunderstanding as to what this was seeking to achieve, so we're going to need to revise it. And while I think there's some flaws, I do think it gives a sort of a degree of guidance as to who, in terms of disclosure, is doing the right thing. Copenhagen, 2 weeks' time. 4 key issues that need to be addressed, ideally. What are the targets going to be for the developed countries? What level of ambitions are we going to be looking at to 2050 and in between? What kind of commitments do we want from major emerging economies, of which we are one? What are we going to do about technology and financial assistance for us, developing countries, and how's that going to be managed? And those are 4 high-level macro minimum objectives that are hoping to be achieved. Huge challenges for South Africa, massively vulnerable, highly carbon intensive, per capita and GDP based, and one of the big developing countries that's going to have pressure to take on proper commitments. And basically, they're looking to get a climate change strategy out by 2010. So I'm going to close off with a call for leadership from business. This is an example of what business did around the Bali communique. Businesses coming together and saying to politicians, we need to work together to address this challenge, because it's bad for business. And the last thought is we need to see this. Many are suggesting that as we get into this crisis, we're going to have to adopt a kind of a war footing. So in the war footing, what kind of leader are we going to see? And my final point is this one, is I think this financial crisis is a wonderful opportunity to address the challenges that we're facing. It's a chance to reshape the financial mechanisms. So I'm going to end there, and hopefully we can take some questions. And thanks for your time.